guys, it's Arielle. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you guys are all doing well. Welcome to the next video in my series talking about apartment hunting in Paris. As you can of course tell by the title, today is going to be a quick video discussing the differences, the pros and the cons of renting through an agency versus a landlord. When I first moved to France, this concept was very new to me. Back home in Canada, I had always rented through landlords. I didn't even know that the possibility of using an agency existed. And not only did I not know that you could use an agency to find an apartment, I really didn't understand the implications of renting with an agency versus with a landlord. And it's just such a different rental culture here in France. You can't even go 100 meters in Paris without seeing all sorts of rental agencies with pictures of the beautiful properties that they're renting hanging in their windows. Today's video topic is going to be dedicated to this. I have rented probably upwards of 10 different apartments in France. I've rented from landlords, I've rented from agencies. This video is really going to be coming from my understanding through my experiences that I've had with landlords and agencies in France and in Paris. And as always, if you guys have any questions on this topic, please leave them down in the comments below. I will answer them all. Before we get into the pros and the cons, let's very quickly talk about what it means to rent from an agency and what it means to rent from a landlord. The definitions are very quick. Renting from a landlord really is as obvious as it sounds. A landlord is likely someone who owns a property, who owns an apartment, and is renting this property out themselves. Renting through an agency, on the other hand, is when you have the property owner outsource this rental property management, this building management to a third-party company, which is the agency. So when you're renting through the agency, you really don't have any contact with the property owner. Everything is done through the agency, which is the middleman. Now that that is clearly defined, let's get into the pros and the cons, starting with an agency. Starting with the pros, an agency is relatively credible and reliable. They are companies, they are businesses, they are in some way much more accountable to the law, to renter legislation than an individual landlord is because they're a company. You also have the possibility of Googling an agency and reading the reviews before you decide to trust them and rent a property through them. A second pro is that with an agency, because they are sort of representing the property owner, everything is done in a very organized and official way. And on this same note of organization and timeliness and order, when you rent a property through an agency, they are often very reactive whenever you have any sort of question, whenever you have any sort of problem, because again, you and the property owner are their clients. They want everything to go smoothly. An example I can give you of this is when I was in Aix-en-Provence, I was renting with an agency, and we had a couple problems with some of the outlets in the wall. We called the agency, and the next day they sent someone over to repair them. So it was very quick, the communication was easy, and everything was taken care of in a very professional way. The third pro, I would say, with renting with an agency is that not only do they often have the highest quantity of apartments available, but they also have the highest quality. I have found that between renting with a landlord versus an agency, the agency often ensures that the property is well maintained, that everything is very clean, that any damages are repaired. You really are more likely than not stepping into a well-maintained property, more so than when you're dealing with a private landlord. Again, I think this goes back to the whole idea that this really is a business transaction for them as a company. So they want to make sure that the apartments, that the houses they represent, the property owners that they represent, are of a high enough quality and are strictly following any laws, any sort of checks that need to be done. Like I was saying, everything is very official. I think in this category, though, the biggest pro for me was that agencies just do have more properties available than landlords. The ratio in Paris, I want to say, is probably 70% of apartments are owned by agencies and 30% are run by landlords. Now, moving on to the cons, there is quite an extensive list. If you guys are thinking of renting with an agency, I really would definitely pay attention to this part of the video. The first con is that when you're renting through an agency, you have to pay what is called a frais d'agence. That is the cost of doing business with the agency. Your fee as a renter to the agency is upfront. Typically, the agency fees are done by a certain amount per meter squared. It differs, of course, depending on the region where you're renting. In Paris, for example, the agency fees will be 12 euros per meter squared. So, for example, if you're renting a 20 meter squared apartment, 20 times 12 is 240 euros. and that is a supplemental fee that you'll have to pay to the agency when you sign your contract. The next con of an agency, or at least what I would consider to be a con, is that everything is really done by the book with an agency, which I guess sounds like a pro when you say it like that, but it can just be very time-consuming and very unnecessary. An example that I can give you of this is when I was renting with the agency in Aix-en-Provence, there was a whole issue of having to sign the lease. And, you know, we live in modern times, so I was under the impression that I would be able to electronically sign the lease from Canada before moving to France. However, this was not the case. I had to pay more than 100 euros to have the document expedited to me from France to Canada. I had to physically sign the document and to send them back with like super priority speed because everything had to be signed within a certain date. So for me, this was extremely inconvenient. I can appreciate the sentiment behind wanting someone to sign a contract live, but just the fact of the matter is that today a lot of things are done electronically, and I would have appreciated if there was some sort of leniency on this. Another aspect of this going by the book con is that they only accept candidates who have the perfect housing application. And you could say, well, Arielle, that's normal. They want someone with clear paperwork. But you know, it's often not as clear-cut as this. An example would be that most agencies do not accept renters that don't have French guarantors. As an international person, I can't help it. I don't have a French guarantor, but this means that most agencies won't accept me as a renter. They want that sort of guarantee, and it doesn't matter how trustworthy of a person you are. It doesn't matter that you've paid rent on time for your whole life. They just simply will not even entertain your application because there are 27 other candidates who've already submitted applications who have 3 or 4 guarantors, so why would they waste their time with someone like you when they have literally a lineup of people? When I say that agencies go by the book, I really also mean that there's no empathy behind their actions and behind their decision making. They really don't look at you as a person, they look at you as paperwork. And if your paperwork isn't up to their standards, they reject you in 2 seconds because the next person's paperwork is just fine. There really is, specifically in Paris, much more demand than there is supply. So rental agencies really don't fool around with people who don't have the perfect housing dossier. I would also say that because of this thoroughness, because of all of these different rules, it does take a little bit more time to hear back from them about whether or not you got the apartment. Often what will happen with an agency is you'll submit your dossier and they will say, okay, we're reviewing everything. We'll let you know in a couple days if you get it. If you don't get it, we probably won't have any contact. Sorry, we just don't have time to write to everyone. So it's time consuming and you don't necessarily always hear back. Again, there isn't this human to human contact. You are literally just an email sending them your application. There really is no human approach to renting with an agency. The final con that I want to talk about with an agency is that it is much harder, I find, to leave their rental contracts. In France, with the typical contract, you just have to give 1 month's notice and you can leave. With an agency, however, they usually have very detailed, very finicky clauses in the contract that make it much harder for you to leave. And I will give you my own personal example. When I was renting in Aix-en-Provence, I was renting with 2 other roommates. So we're renting this whole apartment through the agency, but we each sort of had our own contract and we each obviously had to pay our own rent. When I wanted to leave the apartment, I had to find my own replacement. I couldn't just give my month's notice and leave like you would with a normal apartment. I had to take pictures, I had to post on all these websites, I had to do viewings, and once I found my candidate, I couldn't just have him replace me. I then had to arrange an interview with my roommates. They had to approve this new renter, and once they approved, the agency then had to approve this renter's application. And then finally, once everyone approved, they could re-sign a brand new lease, which of course had to be signed by both the renters and the guarantors all over again. I kid you not, this process was so long. It was so complicated and it was so stressful. I absolutely hated every single aspect involved with breaking my contract with the agency. In real life, with the landlord, it is really not this hard. You literally just give 1 month's notice and you are out of there. That's it. Normally you are not responsible for having to find the new renter. Sorry, I know that was a bit long. I just want to make sure everything is very clear for you guys. Moving on, let's talk about the pros and cons of renting with a landlord. We'll start with the cons this time. I think the biggest and most common con of renting with a landlord is that because they are not, I guess, accountable to the law in exactly the same way as an agency might be, there is, I would say, a higher chance of being scammed through a landlord than there is of an agency. This is something that is relatively low risk if you take the time to meet the landlord, to speak with them, and to really familiarize yourself with them and to sort of build a connection and build trust. In my 5 years of renting in France, I have never once been scammed by a landlord. I really just think this is avoidable if you take the time to fully assess the character of the landlord you're thinking of renting from, and if you make smart decisions. What I mean by this is that if a landlord asks you to pay all sorts of money before even signing the lease, before getting the keys, that's a red flag. If you get to the apartment and it's completely trashed and they're like, oh, we'll fix it later, red flag. You want to be a smart renter, and if you are a smart renter, there's relatively low risk of being scammed by a landlord, even if they aren't this big agency company. The second con I've kind of already mentioned is the ratio between apartments that are available through landlords and versus agencies is slim through landlords. It really is slim pickings. They are often not the best apartments, and there is few apartments. There's even fewer really good apartments that are available to you through landlords. Ultimately, if you're really picky in the place you want to live, if you have a lot of criteria about the apartment you want to rent, you will probably not find that with a landlord, just because the quantity of apartments available and the quality doesn't necessarily match up. And again, this isn't to say that the apartments that are being rented by landlords are dingy or trashy or anything like that. But yeah, the slim pickings issue really is a big con for me. And finally, the third con is that the landlord is likely slower in response time than the agency. My general feeling on this topic is that most landlords want to consider their rental property as passive income. They don't want to consider this as a job to them. It's just like free money coming in every month. Whereas with an agency, it's their job. Their client is you, and their client is the property owner. And so when it comes to things like repairs, when it comes to things like being reactive, the landlord will be slower. And I can give you 2 examples. The first time I moved into the apartment I am in right now, within the first week, I realized that actually only one electrical socket worked, and I sent a message to the landlord and I was like, hey, can we get this fixed? And she was like, yeah, sure, I'll look into it, no problem. I've been here a year and a half and none of the electrical sockets have been fixed. And then a month ago, there was like a little fissure in the kitchen sink, which led to leaking. And so I taped it up and I was like, hey, can we get this fixed? Like, water is going everywhere. And the tape sort of helped it a little bit. And the landlord was like, yeah, sure, like no problem, we can get that fixed. It's been 3 months and nothing has been fixed. So, landlords generally do treat their properties as passive income. And so when it comes to communication, when it comes to repairs, they're just not as reactive as the agency because they don't have the same sort of accountability as an agency would to the property owner. Now let's get into the list of pros of renting with a landlord. I wanted to save this for last because personally my preference is always to rent through a landlord because of this pros list. And so if you are an international renter like me, you want to pay attention to these pros because likely you resonate with them as well. And it probably means that most likely renting through a landlord is where you'll have the most success in response rate and in acceptance rate of your housing applications. The first pro is that when you're renting through a landlord, there really is a human-to-human connection. Remember I was saying with the agency, you're just a stack of papers and you have to meet their expectations. With a landlord, you have the chance to meet them, you have a chance to tell them your story, and you have a chance to build some sort of connection, some sort of trusting connection with them. And this allows for empathy from the landlord. And to give you an example of this, my current apartment, I'm renting from a landlord. And when I was looking for an apartment, I was super stressed. I was getting rejected all over the place. And I was getting rejected because I'm international. I don't have a French guarantor, of course. And when I was looking for my apartment, I had started my job, so I had a contract, but I was still within my 3-month trial period. And nobody wants to rent to you when you are in your trial period because there is a small risk that you could be let go by the company. And no one wants to deal with that, with having to find a new renter, with worrying that you're not going to pay the rent. So it's very, very rare that if you're in your trial period, or worse yet, you don't even have a job, people won't rent to you. But I spoke to this landlord twice on the phone. We met in person. And on the phone, she initially had a problem with renting to me, but once we met, she told me that she felt like she could trust me, she felt like I was a trustworthy person, and she was willing to rent to me despite the fact that I didn't have guarantors and that I wasn't done my trial period with my job. So there is something really positive in being able to build that connection and for a landlord to show you empathy, especially as an international person who might not have the by the book application that agencies are looking for. On that same note, renting with a landlord can be a little bit quicker. When you have your visit, when you meet, when you discuss, if there's a good feeling between you and the landlord, they could just be like, great, I'm willing to rent to you, send me your paperwork, and let's get this done tomorrow. That's what happened with this apartment. I went to see it, we built that connection, and I think I signed the contract a couple days later. There was no issue of, oh, like, I have 10 other candidates to look at their applications, and I'll let you know in a week, and I'm not gonna tell you if I don't accept you. It was very simple. It was really based on the connection and the trust that we felt during that meeting. Another thing is that landlords are often a little bit more flexible in the payment method. I remember when I was in Grenoble, my landlord would let me pay him rent in cash just because I hadn't set up a bank account yet in France. And so yeah, once a month he would come to the apartment and I would give him my rent in cash, and it was super simple. With agencies, normally you have to either send post-dated checks or bank transfers, so there's a little bit less flexibility, I feel. Another pro is that the process is often much more simplified than renting with an agency. If you remember the example that I was talking about before about having to literally mail the contract back and forth to sign in person, you don't really have that with landlords. I would say most landlords are comfortable with electronic leases. My current landlord, not so much. We did sign everything in person. But my last landlord in Paris, everything was done electronically. You know, he sent the contract to my email. We all signed everything like with an e-signature, and boom, I had the keys and I was good to go. It really was not some sort of extensive, square, very intense process. And the final pro, which is huge for me, is that renting through a landlord, you're often using like a very simple rental agreement. And this is what I was talking about before, is that often when you're renting with a landlord, you can just give them the classic 1 month notice and you're out of there. There's no sort of obligation to find the next renter. There's no obligation to get the next renter approved by anyone. You as a renter give your notice and you are legally allowed to leave the apartment after 1 month or 3 months if the apartment is unfurnished. Like I said, I cannot even think of a more stressful time than breaking my contract with the agency. Like, it was so much more than just giving notice. Finding the renter and getting him approved by everyone and getting all the paperwork signed again, like it was just such an extensive process. I never want to live that again. For me, this is just another huge reason why renting with a landlord is the way to go. Voila, that is my video on renting with a landlord versus agency. I hope that everything was clear and that this video really gave you a much better understanding of what it's like to rent in Paris, what are the options you have, and what option is best suited for you in your situation. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to leave any comments or questions down below, and I will see you in my next video.